inspired you to sort of insert yourself as a character in your own novel?
In Imposture, I did it for a simple practical reason. Imposture tells the story of Byron's Dr. Polidori, who wanted to be a great writer like Byron, was a handsome, talented young man, and recognized in his travels with Byron, he was there for the famous ghost story session in Geneva, that he actually didn't have Byron's talent, and he had to face the rest of his life knowing the difference between them. But a funny thing happened, and this was true, that a guy called Henry Colburn, who's a publisher, brought out in a magazine the story about vampires that Polidori wrote, partly at Byron's suggestion, during that famous ghost story summer. It was published anonymously, and the publisher hinted heavily that the work had in fact been by Byron, and the story flew off the shelves. Sold 5,000 copies, whatever it was. Apparently Goethe declared it to be Byron's finest work. And so this seemed like a very interesting way of talking about the difference between them. A moment in which Polidori could say to himself, there is no difference between us. The only thing that's different is the name. I am as good as Byron. But I didn't want to have to write a novel in which I explained all the history, and there's no way I could expect the average reader to know it. So I needed some other way of getting it in. The reason I didn't want to put the history in the novel itself is because my idea in writing a historical novel was not to tell history, but to write a novel that could have been contemporary at the time it was written. In that case, I can't say London in 1818. I can't say that. So I had this preface, and the preface was just too functional. So I needed another way of getting the information, and I had this idea of a guy I used to teach high school with, that Horace Mann. I taught there briefly. I don't name Horace Mann in the book, I call it something else. Who writes the manuscripts, and my getting to know him is an excuse for telling the story, the history that I've just given. Something funny happened though when the book came out. I was at a Faber sales conference, and they kind of invite the authors along so that you can make nice to all the sales reps who have to go around the bookstores all over the country and get 10 seconds with your book to try to persuade some bookstore manager to put it on the shelves. And one of them came up to me and said, is the preface true? Quite seriously, the only way the preface would have been true is if I didn't write the book. And it seemed to be an odd thing, but there was another incident that happened when I actually had the Radcliffe, and it was reading from A Quiet Adjustment, the second book. I was reading a scene in which it becomes clear to Byron's wife that Byron's been having an affair with his sister, and someone came up to me in the audience afterwards and said, if I had known that Byron slept with his sister, I wouldn't have come. And both of these things, along with other responses I got into the books, suggested to me that one interesting question is, what kind of truth do you expect from a book? And writers generally hate this question, even though most of them, I think, also want to ask it. And one reason you want to ask it is because if you start off with a body of experience, which can be related to you, and you end with a finished product, then you can work out the chemical equation. And since the writer is in the business of working out chemical equations that get you from a body of experience to a finished product, obviously we're going to be interested in the other side of the equation too, so that we can work out the formula, or after there's a formula, but we can work out the process. So I think most people are interested in this question, especially in historical fiction. It seems to be relevant because one of the things that you want to get from historical fiction is a sense of what actually happened. And to the extent that historical fiction has an audience that novels don't, is because people think that they're getting history light. And so it seemed worth my while to play games with it, and my own insertion of character was one way of doing that. I've got another even longer-winded answer that I can give at the moment. As I talk to you all in silence. Anything else that anybody wants to ask? Yeah.
In the course of the three novels, have your thoughts or ideas about Byron changed in the course of writing the three?
I wrote a piece about Byron for The Guardian a month ago, in which I talked about Childe Harold. This is a roundabout way of answering the question. And I did what you should never do, I guess, which is scrolling down on the online version of the piece. Someone told me about it and finding the responses to what I'd written. Most of which took the form of, how can this guy write a trilogy of novels about Byron when he clearly doesn't like him at all? That's not, it was a misreading. And then I finally had someone stand up and say, actually, I think he probably doesn't like him. And then he said, but I was a student of Ben Markovitz's, which made me feel worse about the whole thing. I don't know that I liked him a lot beforehand. I still actually kind of like him. And I think in this book, I try to present him as his most attractive So one of the problems with doing Byron, obviously, that he was very good at doing himself, not just in poetry, but in the letters and the journals. And so you have to ask yourself, what can you add? And one thing I thought I could add is that even though Byron was very good at telling his life story, he basically didn't do novels. He didn't apply Jane Austen-style craft to the problem of getting a character to move through a situation so that they change. He told anecdotes. And so if I could work out something interesting about the level of style, the kind of style that Byron employed, but use these other novelistic tricks to bring out his story, that might be something I can add to it. But I like writing the sympathetic Byron. So in Imposture, you see him through the envious eyes of Polidori. He doesn't come across particularly well. In the second one, you see him in his marriage, and he's obviously a monster in his marriage. It's not his finest moment. But in this one, I try to show him, especially in that opening bit I read from, vulnerable at 15, and towards the end of his life, also vulnerable in a funny way when he's trying to have an affair with a 15-year-old Greek boy. So I liked him most of this book.
This is kind of the flip side to Kristen's question. I sort of wondered why you didn't insert yourself more, because you've got this filter of your colleague in this book. Why did you feel like you needed that filter?
Oh, why use him at all?
Yeah.
I mean, if I didn't use him at all, there was no drama to the story of giving the back history to Imposture. Then it's still just me saying I've written a novel and used the back. I mean, I could have found another way of telling a story about it, but having a colleague seemed a good one. I also really like high school English teachers. I think I did it briefly. I liked teaching high school English, but I also liked it because you have this idea of someone who spends 40 years of his professional life teaching the classics, not having to write any papers about them, but going back time and time again to Pride and Prejudice, to Great Expectations, finding new things to say about them. And this life devoted entirely to contact with the great books struck me as a kind of fertile ground. So that was one of the reasons I liked the Peter Sullivan character. So, any other questions? It says there's a reception afterwards. Is that bottle of wine there?
We can get more if we have.
No, that's fine. I'm not that thirsty. I'm not thirsty.
I have one more question. What's next?
Not history and not Byron. Something contemporary, I think. Partly the problem with writing. I mean, I like writing historical fiction, and in part because it expands the vocabulary you can use in a funny way. Because I think the Romantics had many more words for character types than we do. And if you read a Jane Austen novel, I once had my students write down all the words they could find in the book that had some reference to character, aspect, address, countenance. All these things were ways of showing how people present themselves in society, which we don't really have a scientific language for. But you're also limited, and so there are all kinds of words that appear in the OED only after, say, 1830, and you want to use them. And you don't get to. I'm not sure I break the rules all the time. Someone pointed out to me in England that people at that period had no beards. And I'm always giving clergymen beards. So I then went through an Austen concordance and put in the word beard, and it didn't appear once. I then went to Walter Scott, that comes up all the time, so I don't know what that means.
Because he was writing stuff.
He was writing historical novels, yeah, I guess so.